Well, thanks everybody for coming. I'm Andrew Bradley. I'm Policy Director with Prosperity Indiana. Welcome to our Policy and Pizza event. We also have a lot of members of the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition here. We're going to have a chance to do introductions. Senator Fadi Kaddour is going to join us in a bit, and we're going to get to hear from him and talk about policy priorities. But I do want to start out with a little bit of like why we're here and what we're going to be discussing. So, get that on. Welcome. So this is what we're here to do today, is we're going to hear a preview of our Prosperity Indiana agenda, as well as the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition priorities. As I mentioned, we're going to get reflections from, well, not the co-chairs here, but Senator Kaddour was one of the legislative members from that housing task force. And we're going to talk about there's a lot of opportunity with housing issues. That's a theme. And housing issues continue to rise up and bubble up in the state policy conversation. And part of what we're going to do today is to talk about how we as the community economic development sector and community members can harness that momentum and make sure that the policies reflect the needs that we're seeing in the community. And that's why we need your input in the community conversation. We need to make sure that we're hearing from you about what you're seeing in the community, and to make sure that Senator Kaddour can reflect that back to the full General Assembly during the session. And we'll finish up, we'll talk about some resources, some ongoing events, some upcoming events, and other ways to keep this momentum building. Because if there's one message that I want you to take from today's event, is that we have to have the engagement of you and your partners and your networks throughout Indiana if we're going to be able to make sustainable policy change statewide. So, our executive director, Jessica Love, was with us, but unfortunately she had a family emergency come up. So I get to cover the Prosperity in Indiana, who we are. So could I ask, folks, raise your hand if you are a Prosperity Indiana member in the room. Okay, so about half of the folks in here. Well, welcome. You may already be aware, but for our newcomers, Prosperity Indiana is the statewide association for community economic development organizations. And what that means, when I came to PI, I had no idea really what community economic development really meant, but it is us. Two-thirds of PI's members are nonprofit organizations. They're community development corporations. They're neighborhood associations. They are Community Action, United Way, AARP, and other community-facing organizations, nonprofits. About 15–16% are public entities, so like cities and towns, like the city of Goshen is a member of PI, for example, and like economic development, regional, public entities. And then the remainder we have some private organizations and individuals like banks that have reason they want to be at the table, they want to be part of the conversation, and we're glad to have everybody. So that's who makes up PI. And we deliver our benefits to members. We use what we call a REAP framework: resources, engagement, advocacy, and programs. And today we're going to touch on a little bit of all of this. We're going to talk about some of the resources that are available in communities that we work with, engagement, and that's kind of what we're doing here today. Advocacy, obviously we're going to be talking a lot about policy today. And then programs, we'll be talking about our coalition work and some of the other programmatic work that we are engaging on these issues. And so let me bring up a PI member and close coalition partner, Amber, to do our group introductions.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amber Marr, and I am the Legislative Director for AARP Indiana. And we're so excited that you're here today. So real fast, as Andrew mentioned, we're just going to go around quickly, if you wouldn't mind, so we can introduce ourselves and know who's in the room with us today. And we're just going to say your name, your role, and your organization. And then I know Andrew sort of already had people raise their hand if you're a Prosperity Indiana member or a Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition member. But if you could just mention that when you're saying that, that would be amazing. And then also one word or phrase to describe what keeps you up at night about Indiana's current climate for housing, affordability, and stability. So since I already introduced myself, I'll go ahead and give you an example. So Amber Marr, AARP Indiana Legislative Director, and I am both a Prosperity Indiana member and a Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition member. And I would say that my one word or phrase, what keeps me up at night, is, I would say, urgency. And Andrew, would you like to me?
Well, I would suggest, well,
How do you want to? Should we just let them speak real loud, or yeah?
Okay.
Okay.
So just try to project. So we can pick you up on the microphone. But actually, let's start up in the front row. I'd like to ask people. I want to let people get pizza. Let's go row by row. And please feel free. We've got pizza. We've got soda. We're just going to have to carry on. So I'm going to do my best to project. But I said we meant for this to be a community conversation, and we want to bring you food. So I'm going to ask people in the front row, since they're the brave ones, they sat up front, and then they first did one. Go ahead and feel free to get the pizza, and we're just going to start going on the program. I know that Senator Condor is on his way. He's going to join us at some point. But with that said, I want to go ahead and we want to talk about our policy priorities and to set up a community conversation. Before we do, I do want to briefly mention a few of the highlights that we learned when we did a series of regional meetings throughout the state. So although we're talking a lot about housing today, is this thing on? Anything? No? All right. I'll just keep projecting as best as I can. Although we're going to be talking primarily about housing, we understand that that issue isn't in a vacuum in our communities. So you can see up here, when we did a series of 6 of these meetings statewide in the summer and early fall, we found that there are these interrelated issues of financial health and stability. And kind of this recurring theme of there are some things that are stripping wealth out of our families and our communities, and that impacts housing, but it also impacts their financial security and stability. And we'll take a look at this in a sec, but these are statewide, but they're impacting specific regions, specific communities, and there's definitely disparities by race and by gender and other demographics. And that the organizations that serve these communities are really still feeling the pinch. Even though there's this feeling, the pandemic, we're kind of beyond that. The economic disruptions, increased costs, staffing issues, burnout, that the organizations are really feeling that. So even though we're going to focus a lot on housing, we understand that there's a broader universe of issues. And that makes it into our policy priorities. So just want to give you a little snapshot of what we found. Families and communities, even before the pandemic, 1 in 4 households in Indiana were not able to withstand the loss of income without going into asset poverty. So just want to set the scene that is different by county, and families were hurting even before the pandemic. That's the point there. We will provide these slides later so you can dig into the data. I don't want to spend too much time on it now. So that was a pre-existing issue. We talked about that there are racial disparities. That comes into financial stability. So statewide, while about 60% had saved for emergencies, there's a big difference between white households, 64%, and households of color, barely over half. Also foregoing doctor visits. Nearly 1 in 5 Latino households were foregoing doctor visits because of costs, compared to only 11% of white households. So those things have that multiplying effect that also shows itself in housing. Medical debt is another one of those issues that we found. Indiana has the 11th highest share of the population who are in active medical debt in the U.S. And that ends up being about 1 in 6 Hoosiers. We're also the highest amongst our Midwest neighbors. So again, we want to convey these are all interrelated factors, and when we talk about policy solutions, we recognize that these all play a part. Another wealth stripping factor that is definitely worth mentioning is payday loans and predatory lending. I'm seeing nodding throughout the room. All right, so this is another issue. And when you talk about families who are having trouble paying their rent, if they're having their income sucked out by predatory payday loans, then that is a robbing Peter to pay Paul situation in itself. So want to make sure we are aware of that, and that shows up in some of our recommendations. I know this is a little hard to read, but this is a place that I do like to make sure that I point out. We're talking about wealth stripping and wealth building factors. Indiana has a housing policy framework that unfortunately can be a wealth stripping factor for too many of our households. There is a gap of over 135,000 affordable and available renter households, especially for the bottom 30% of the income spectrum. And we heard this, you were telling us this. This is what you were saying to us. So the largest percent of the lowest income folks are in the workforce. So low income working families are seeing that gap. But also we're talking about disabled households. We're talking about older households. We're talking about caregivers. These are the folks who are, the data supports what you were just telling us. And two stats that I'll point out here, and we'll keep moving. There's only 38 affordable and available rental units for every 100 of the lowest income Hoosiers. So think about that. Out of 100 low-income Hoosiers, there's only 38 units that they have to go around. And we'll see what happens when they don't have those in a bit. The other stat that I point to is that 72%. So out of that lowest income bucket, nearly 3/4 of them are spending more than half of their income on housing. And so that is in itself a predictor of eviction and homelessness and housing instability. If you miss one paycheck and you're paying over half your income, there's not a good chance that you would have saved for emergencies, as we've already seen, and be able to cover that disruption. And between COVID, rising costs, this is that crisis that causes those issues. And we see it throughout the state, but we see it especially here in central Indiana. Again, I know it's really small, but so I said 38 affordable and available statewide. In Marion County, it's only 20. Only 1 in 5 of the lowest income households can find a place that meets the standards of affordability here in this county. And 80% of those households are spending more than half of their income on housing. 80% of our lowest income households. And so we wonder why we're hearing all these issues about urgency, scarcity. You're seeing it already, and the data backs it up. So these are the scenario that brought us into why we created our policy agenda the way that we did. So one, to set it up, we listen to what you tell us, we look at the data, and we create our policy agenda based off of that. It's also important to mention that a big factor behind all this is the lack of adequate income. So 9 out of Indiana's top 20 occupations pay less than what is needed to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rate. And you all know that fair market rate doesn't mean that that's what actually is available when you open the classified ads and when you go to rent.com or when you look on Craigslist or when you drive up and down and try to find a for rent sign. And on the right-hand side, that shows that our renter incomes are increasingly and steadily and increasingly out of step with the rest of the Midwest. So we are not keeping up on the income side. So unless we're suddenly able to boost our incomes, we need housing policies that are specifically designed for the lowest income households. One other thing that I'll play out, this impacts the ability for Hoosiers to be able to get into a permanent home that they own. Sometimes we hear that home ownership is the gold standard and that's what everybody should be shooting for. Well, unfortunately, there are some really clear racial disparities and increasing racial disparities over the past decade. You can see here that black home ownership has decreased statewide by 5% just in the past decade. And these are long-term issues. So if we want to stand up home ownership, we need to make sure that we're supporting what it takes to get to that place. All right. One other thing, again, racial disparities, really clear. We've been tracking eviction rates. We've been tracking emergency rental assistance. We've been tracking the number of households behind on rent. And we can see clear patterns that these are statewide issues, but you can see that even just by the color, that they are prevalent in specific parts of the state. And on the right-hand side of the 4 in 10 have seen housing instability during the pandemic, compared to only less than 20% of white households. Families with children, 36%, have been housing unstable during the pandemic, compared to only 21% without children. So again, we are really aware that there are clear disparities, even though the problem is statewide. All right. So that's the background. That's what we've seen. That's what you've told us. That's what the data tells us. Now I'm going to tell you this is how we've put what we see as the best opportunities to take action on this over the coming year. PI, every year we set up our policy agenda on state policies, federal policies, administrative policies. And I've talked about how we source. We listen to you. We vet it with our board, and we count on you to help us implement them by having relationships with your policymakers. You have copies of this behind you. I am not going to march you through all 30 of our policy priorities, but I do want you to refer to them when we are having our big conversation. I did want to at least point out, and this is all on there, we have several urgent issues. Our members told us that they really are feeling much the same things what you were just telling us, that there's housing instability, that there's evictions. They want us to help stand up permanent emergency rental assistance and strengthen tenant protections. They want us to counter economic disruptions, including those wealth stripping issues like payday loans. They want us to regulate problem properties. Remember that big murmur when we heard about the out-of-state landlords and who are allowing properties to go into disrepair? They want us to find ways to be able to tackle those issues. And they want us to tackle those disparities by race, by other demographic factors, and look at some of the underlying issues that are causing that instability. Okay, so that's, you have our PI policy agenda. We're going to talk about that. Now this is a point where I'd like to ask the folks who are the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition members, or steering committee members, and if you're on calls with us all the time, you'll know you're a steering committee member, to come up and join us. We want to talk a bit about our policy priorities for the coming year. These are the steering committee members, so if you're with one of these folks, come on up with us. Thank you. Yeah. And if somebody could take a picture of us while we're up here, that would be great. Yeah, Hale, you ought to be up here too. You are our coordinator.
Are you not?
Come on up.
Hale, if you're listening, no. Oh, you're also pretty.
Oh, thank you. So, these are just some of those steering committee members. And you can see this is more than just Prosperity Indiana. This is a group statewide effort. So our coalition, we've realized that in order to affect the issues we've been talking about, we need to increase the supply of housing, we need to increase access to housing, and we need to increase housing stability and habitability standards. Oh, yeah, this is what I was just saying. That's what it's going to take. And in just a minute, we're going to have Senator Cadora talk to us about the Housing Task Force. Senator Cadora, feel free to grab a slice of pizza if you would like to. Okay. But there is a moment that's happening in state policy discussions. We've heard a few times that this is going to be a housing session of the Indiana General Assembly. However, we want to make sure it's the right type of housing session. And we want to make sure that they are attuned to the issues that you talked about and not some other versions of that, or that they keep what your needs are in mind. So there's a few things that we have come up with as ways to try to capture that moment. We would like to see the General Assembly create a housing stability pilot fund. We just heard about IndyRent has run out of money. The Indiana Emergency Rental Assistance Program, they've closed their portal. So those resources have dropped out. We're hoping that there will be a federal permanent solution, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that all the progress that's been created doesn't die on the vine. And that's why we're asking in this budget session to find funding, whether it's state funding or ready funding or another pot of funds, to be able to have a stopgap fund to serve as a bridge. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but we want to create a way for Hoosiers who live in rental housing with health and safety violations to put rent into escrow or be able to repair the issues themselves and deduct from their rent. And then also want to make sure that we provide court-based eviction diversion programs. So this is what we mean, this issue about the Housing Stability Pilot Fund. Even though Indiana has served over 60,000 with emergency rental assistance and probably will still continue to be able to assist a few more, there's still another 77,000 households that are estimated to be behind at rent. And there's 87,000 Hoosier children in those households that are still at risk. So the need is still greater than we've been able to serve yet to date. And the line you see here is there's still about 12% of renter households that are at risk. So that's what that pilot fund would be able to help. We'll talk more about the need for rent escrow, but these are some of the issues that we hear all the time. We hear these stories about people living in black mold or with raw wiring hanging down, and I'm sure that you can help us fill in some of those stories. But unfortunately, according to Indiana law, you still have to pay 100% of your rent 100% on time, and if you don't, you're subject to the exact same eviction measures as anybody else would be. And there's no enforcement mechanism to make the negligent landlords that are out there be able to fix this type of issue. And I know that D. Ross with the Ross Foundation and the Indianapolis Tenants' Rights Union has filled in with some stories here. I don't know, Lauren, if you have anything at top of mind, if you've come across these type of folks in the past.
Yeah, I wish, yes, thank you. I wish that I did not come across those stories. They come in faster than I could even find solutions for our citizens, to be completely honest. We're on the topic of talking about severe health and safety violations that are putting our renters at risk, that they're living in subpar housing. We have people. You mentioned a story. I'm working right now through the Indianapolis Tenants' Rights Union with a woman. She's 8 months pregnant. She is facing an eviction. I was in court with her this past Tuesday, I think it was, and it was just she and I sitting on one side of the courtroom and her landlord with an attorney on the other side of the room. And all I could really do, because on that day there were no attorneys present. You may not know that you could have an eviction court date on a day where you would need legal representation, and legal representation is not there. And you're still facing an attorney on the other side. So that's a work in progress, but I see these things constantly. I see issues, speaking of the intersections, with domestic violence and housing. We have Department of Child Services and housing. We're all interconnected. There's so many stories to tell, but I don't want to keep you guys here forever. But the most important thing that I do want to stress with going through and talking about all of the stories and what our citizens are going through, there is not enough help. I've heard at least 2 other people in the crowd say, like, you are in the community, you're working with families, and you get to that point where you just do not know what else could be done. And unfortunately, like myself and many of us in the room, we are watching that fast-moving train that we cannot stop. So I am happy to be here. I am happy that we are all gathered here to come up, to communicate and to come up with solutions to help our neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And just to mention, this is not a state of nature. This is a policy choice. Indiana is one of only a handful of states, again, that does not allow, have a legal mechanism, a working mechanism to be able to put that rent in those situations into escrow or to repair the issue themselves and deduct it. We have chosen as a state and as policymakers to incentivize those bad actor landlords to be able to get off scot-free with those situations we saw before. And to be clear, not every landlord is a bad actor, but we've made it so that they are incentivized or they don't have enforcement mechanisms to prevent those issues. You have all this, so we're not going to talk through this, but these are other recommendations that we have, ways that we're looking for to find opportunities in what we're hearing is an upcoming housing session. And we'll let you look at those. There's we got to keep moving, but these are some of the issues that we're looking at. So with that, I'm really pleased to be able to bring forward State Senator Fadi Kadora, that we're here in your home district, and we're so happy to have you here. I do want to take a second, folks, if you have your cell phone, you can download right now the final report of the Indiana Legislative Housing Task Force. And you can see what the recommendations look like. And I want you to compare what you see there to what you see here. And as you do, I want to point out number 16, the last and final recommendation of that task force is to address substandard housing. And the person who is responsible for that being on that list is at the back of the room here. I was there in the room, yes. That final recommendation was not in the draft list. And Senator Fadi Kadora stood up and said, I'll let you say what you said, but it is there to that. So let's welcome Senator Fadi Kadora. And this is our microphone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Well, is it afternoon or is it still morning? I didn't check my time. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be with you today. I see many friends, many colleagues. I live 1 mile away from here, so this is my home community. I appreciate you for deeply caring about housing policies. I'll share with you briefly my passion for this topic. You don't have to be a homeless person to care about housing policies, but I was homeless before. My wife and I and our 3-week-old baby experienced homelessness after Hurricane Katrina. We lived in the South before we moved to Indiana. And I walked in the shoes of a homeless person. I understand the anxiety. I understand the lack of stability, the concern as a family that tries to live in a safe place that they can call home. Housing policy is critical, not just only to so that you can say that I own a home. The housing policy impacts so many other critical things in our communities. Based on your neighborhood and your community, where you live, how you live, with who you live, it impacts the fabrics of our society. It impacts our democratic practices of how we engage with one another. It impacts stability for families. How many of you, for example, heard about gentrification? So you've heard about, not far away from here, in our district, in our community, Lakeside Point apartment complex. Have you heard about the issues this way? College on 91st. So when I first got elected in 2020, one of the first things that came to my attention was the Lakeside Point apartment complex, which was brought to my attention by amazing folks in the Housing Coalition, including Patchwork Indy, St. Luke's, First Baptist Church, and others. And we immediately engaged in a community effort to deal with this issue before the other properties that were owned by JPC became an issue for the state of Indiana. So we mobilized the forces to take care of our families in that apartment complex. And many of those families have young kids who attend our school system. So housing also impacts education. It impacts how people interact with others in the community. What broke my heart is when I walked through or in that apartment complex and I witnessed personally the horrifying images that I saw personally and the ones that were communicated to me that I shared on the Senate floor. If any of you followed the story on Lakeside, you've seen the mold grow through the carpets, holes in the ceilings. Water was cut off during critical times. Sometimes hot water was running in the summertime and cold water running in the wintertime. Buildings were unsafe. Some of the structures were about to collapse. So I said, how is it that the General Assembly is hesitant to go after criminals? We're not asking the General Assembly to punish responsible landlords or responsible tenants. I'm just asking the General Assembly to do its job by going after criminals. I thought that's the basic job of the General Assembly, is to create laws to protect the citizens. These are compliant, hardworking Hoosier families who paid their rent, they paid their utilities, and an out-of-state, negligent, irresponsive, criminal entity took advantage of people. So what I did is that my job is to work for my community. That's why I ran for office. So I went to our AG, the Attorney General of the state of Indiana. I'll pause for a second. It's my job to work with every elected official to serve my district. And I will extend my hand to work with every colleague, regardless of who they are, Republicans or Democrats. Because at the end of the day, those families care less about my political affiliation or anybody else's. They just want to live in safe houses, in safe communities. They want to raise their kids and they want to be happy. So I went to Todd Rokita, our AG, and I persistently told him we need to do something on this. And finally, his team took on the case, and they filed a lawsuit. And the Superior Court judge decided that the AG does not have jurisdiction on this matter because JPC was registered as a nonprofit organization, and in Indiana, nonprofit organizations fall under the jurisdiction of the Secretary of State and not the AG. So that became an issue, but the judge moved the case into mediation, and they allowed creditors and lenders and bankers and utilities such as Citizens to be a party to the mediation process. They were, Citizens was threatening to cut off water because they were owed $1.2 million of hard-working dollars by taxpayers who paid it to JPC, but those dollars never made it to the utilities. Kept persistently working on this issue. I introduced legislation in my first session to work on this. A couple of pieces of legislation, Senate Bill 230, Senate Bill 236. And we came up with a model to say that if you're a tenant, responsible tenant, and you're dealing with an irresponsive, out-of-state, negligent landlord, then you will be able to withhold your rent to fix these emergency systems such as your HVAC or running water or plumbing. And you will be able to fix it if the landlord is irresponsive to your needs. A couple of my colleagues, including the chair of the committee that I introduced the bill, in their committee were sympathetic, but they opposed the legislation. And I was perplexed. Why would you? And the chair of the committee told me his father is a former building commissioner in their county, and he deeply cares about public safety, housing issues, and all of that. I want to extend the grace and think that he was very sincere in his comment that he deeply cared about this issue. But I'll tell you the facts. The apartment association called and presented a legal paper that said that this is not a problem that requires legislative changes. The city can just sue. But the city already tested the limits of the law in the court system and it didn't work. So we needed to do something legislatively. So after weeks and weeks and weeks of pushing aggressively to do something about this issue, the chair of the committee agreed to change my bill into a summer study committee about housing issues. And it passed the Senate unanimously. Now, fast forward this summer, because of things that happened on the House side and the Senate side, there was consensus that we need to study the issue of housing. Now, my focus is not only on dealing with Lakeside Point. I was successful with the help of our community to bring a lawsuit, bring the city of Indianapolis on board, and our goal was to remove the ownership of the apartment complex and move it into a private receivership so that we can improve the living conditions. The city was successful. I'm still cautiously optimistic because we are still trying to monitor the relationship of the new owner with the previous owner to be sure that there's no connection and that they improve the conditions. I drove by the apartment complex last night. I still saw a few buildings that are boarded up, and we want to be sure that, that we continue to pressure them to improve the living conditions. But also, we have not changed other pieces of important pieces of legislation as it relates to protecting tenants. And it seems there's a cultural and political stigma that if you are a tenant or if you rent, it reminds me back of what happened in the 1800s. I wasn't born then, but I promise you. In the 1800s, if you were white, Christian, male or female, you couldn't even vote if you were a non-property owner. I'm not talking about my siblings in the black community who were deprived of their rights. I'm talking even if you were white, Caucasian, Christian, male or female, but if you were a non-property owner, you were deprived even from voting. So there's a stigma in our community that if you're a tenant, you're not as equal. And I always argue with my colleagues, tenants are property taxpayers. Because through your rental payment, you are paying the property taxes that the landlord pays. The landlord is not opening a charitable nonprofit organization to house you. They charge you for utilities. They charge you for their property taxes. They charge you for their staff. They charge you for everything that comes with housing. So you are, as tenants, property taxpayers. So why is it that always tenants do not get the attention that they need? And as Andrew mentioned, I was extremely frustrated as a member of the Housing Task Force, where none of the 15 recommendations talked about tenants. My colleagues spoke passionately about fixing the housing crisis, dealing with it in Indiana. And I said, what about the 1 million+ tenants? Because if you want to build new structures and not regulate those to be protected, guess what's going to happen to those new structures? They're going to become the next Lakeside Point apartment complex. So you want to increase the supply of housing, but at the same time you're losing supply by allowing other properties to be neglected and so on. So I said you cannot ignore affordable housing and disconnect that topic from affordable units, rental units, and not only rental units for one group of our population. There are groups of our population, including senior citizens or individuals with different levels of physical and behavioral and mental abilities, that they need different structures, different types of buildings and homes. And we have not kept with buildings new supply of affordable units since the last recession. I mean, Andrew's presentation showed maybe the need for 135,000 affordable units. I've seen other presentations by other groups talking about 450,000 affordable units needed in Indiana. So there's some wide range, but the point is there is a need. So for almost 20+ years, renters in Indiana, you qualify for an state income tax deduction if you're a renter, and if you don't own other properties. It didn't change for 20 to 30 years. So I'm introducing several pieces of legislation and reintroducing legislation from the last session. And let me recap all of that of what I'm doing. So one, because there was hesitation last session on the renter's ability to withhold rent, my colleagues, who many of them are landlords, If you would like to Google conflict of interest at the General Assembly, I think just be sure that you have a few hours on your hands and that, listen, I lived through difficult life experiences. Even though I came as an immigrant, my wife and kids were born and raised over here. We went through so many difficult things. I was homeless before. I lost my brother-in-law to gun violence. He was killed at his family business. We lost family members who had cancer as young as 4 years old. When you live through difficult life experiences, you understand what your purpose, what your compass, moral compass is. I care less about elections. I prefer to maintain my integrity over maintaining my office. And I don't know if I'm going to live one more day on this earth, and if I live, I just want to do God's will of being sure that every single human is respected, protected, loved, dignified, and has an equal opportunity of succeeding. That's my goal. But the point is, so going back, so one, increasing the tenant's deduction or renter's deduction, which has not changed for 20-some years, plus years. Second, I'm changing that model, which was opposed by the General Assembly. They were hesitant. So I'm changing it to what Andrew described, which is the escrow account model. So the way that the escrow account model, as Ohio and other states implemented that, is basically if you have an emergency system failure in your apartment or your house or in your living unit, you can go and you submitted a written notice to your landlord, and they were irresponsive. They did not share with you, did not fix it in a timely manner. You can go to the court and actually file a complaint. If you file a complaint against the landlord, the judge will give 0 to 1 to 14 days, and that's the average that we saw nationwide, for the landlord to fix these issues. If that doesn't happen, the judge is going to order the rental payments to start going to an escrow account. If the landlord doesn't fix these things, the judge is going to order the maintenance to happen out of that escrow account to get things done. That's the very high level of the escrow account model. It was in Ohio, other places, and as Andrew said, I think 45 states in the nation have some kind of tenants protection. Only 5. One of them is Indiana that does not. So the escrow account, increasing the tenants' deductions, and then for homeowners, I'm working on a couple of pieces of legislation too. Because of COVID, assessed value went up significantly. So we have to be thoughtful to not introduce legislation that only reacts to the last 2 years, but something that is sustainable. Because of gentrification issues, meaning when your assessed value goes up and you're on fixed income, you're forcing people who can't afford to pay their bills to leave. And that changes the composition of our communities. So there's momentum at the General Assembly to cap your property tax bills. So I'm introducing legislation to cap the property tax bills in both directions. What does that mean? If you have a $200,000 home and it went to $300,000, you're still paying the 1% constitutional requirement, but your payment goes from $2,000 to $3,000. For some families, this is a significant amount of money, and if you're on fixed income, it's a lot of money. You start making decisions between buying your medication versus paying your taxes. So what I'm doing is that to say no more than 5% increase in either way, which means the following. You know, your property taxes also fund our local school system, so you have to be mindful of that. We don't want to impact our school system. But I don't want our citizens to experience a 30% increase in their property taxes. And that's what happened in the last 2 years. In our community, from Senate District 30, there were several families who reached out to me who said, I got kicked off of the homestead or the senior citizens credit because their home value went above the threshold. So the threshold, if you're 65 and older, and your joint income, if you're filing jointly, you and your spouse, is $40,000 a year, or if you're single senior citizen and you make $30,000 or less, and your home value is $200,000 or less, currently you qualify for $14,400 credit towards your assessed value, which means instead of you paying taxes on $200,000, you pay taxes on around $185,000. But if your home value during COVID went from 200 to 250, 300, 350, now you started getting kicked out of that credit because your home value is no longer 200,000 or less. So I was successful last session. My Senate Bill 236 was incorporated in an agency bill in DLGF's bill. and I suggested raising the threshold to $400,000, the assessed value. I wasn't successful to reach my goal, but I was successful in getting it to $247,000. So I was still able to protect those who saw an increase of $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, all the way to $247,000. I will continue working on this session, and I want to try to take it to $300,000 if I can. I will double I'm introducing legislation to try to double the tenant's deduction. Currently, it's $3,000 on your state income tax. I'm going to try to double that. The escrow account is going to be a separate bill. And then in my escrow account bill, I'm adding language to grant the AG of the state of Indiana jurisdiction over negligent nonprofit landlords. So I'm changing the law for that, and I'm gaining momentum on this. Senator Aaron Freeman might be working with me on this, and he might draft a specific bill for that issue. So I met with him recently, and we're working on that. Did I miss anything on housing policy issues that we talked about?
You talked about your renter's tax credit?
Yes, I mentioned it. So it's currently $3,000 towards your state income tax. If you don't own other home and your primary residence is the unit that you rent, you qualify for $3,000. So I'm trying to take it to $6,000. It will not pass in the General Assembly at $6,000, but if you ever notice how negotiations happen at the State House, I prefer to start with a higher bar or threshold, so by the end of the negotiations, we might end up at $4,000 or $4,500. But if I start at $4,000, they're gonna nickel and dime, and I don't wanna do that. So I wanna start with a higher objective of that. So I'll stop at this point. I would love to answer your questions on housing and affordability in our state. Yes?
So I know specifically Philadelphia as an example.
What is your name, if you don't mind me?
My name is Steph Gray.
Steph, pleasure meeting with you. Thank you. You reminded me of something I already drafted in the bill that I'm introducing that I did not speak about. So and I spoke extensively at other events with Prosperity Indiana about my efforts on this. In the same escrow account bill that I'm having the AG language to, there's a section where I'm requiring any out-of-state investor to contract with an Indiana headquartered property management entity. So what I did, here's where I started. I ran into constitutional issues. I started drafting the legislation to say that we're going to have moratorium for at least 5 years on out-of-state investors buying homes in Indiana. I ran into constitutional issues based on the Commerce Clause. You cannot prohibit interstate, transactions. So our team of lawyers recommended that we follow something that has precedent in state law. So many years ago, if you remember, when we had the hailstorms, and some contractors from other states came in. Some of them did a miserable job. They left, and there was no legal remedy to go after them. So in the aftermath of that case, they suggested that Indiana came up with some requirements that you have to contract with a local property management entity. They have to have a 5-year presence in Indiana at least, and they must have a physical headquarters in the state. So I borrowed that language, and I applied it to the out-of-state investors in my bill. And to conclude on that thought, what drove my interest in that topic specifically are two things. One, I'm not sure if you've seen, there was a documentary that featured like a few months ago. They highlighted the city of Fishers, which is an affluent community, but basically assessed value and the inventory of affordable houses is significantly declined because out-of-state, out-of-country investors have been buying properties in those communities. While I appreciate how our economy works, we have a crisis in Indiana, affordable housing crisis, and I want to protect our Hoosier citizens from increased prices of procuring homes, renting homes. It's driving rental prices up. It's driving home prices up, and it's taking inventory away from people who desperately need it within the state. A final thought, many years ago, do you remember the blight issue that we had in Indianapolis when we had thousands of units that were, boarded up and all of that stuff? One of the major issues we had was out-of-state investors who bought those homes during a recession, slept in those properties, kept them dormant for years, and when the economy came up, they never fixed them. They just want to make a quick buck and sell them again. So that's why I'm interested in that topic, and it is part of my legislation. Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, sir. I'll tell you this, I'm one of the most hopeful, optimistic people on earth. And I sometimes get asked the question of, how does it feel to be in the super minority? And always my response is the greatest honor on earth to try to walk in the footsteps of Dr. King when he was standing up for a fight, for a cause. I always quote, I teach about his legacy in my classes. Doctor, and I'm sorry if I'm standing on my soapbox and not answering your question directly, but I'll share that with you because it means a lot to me. We've got a couple of things we'll talk about. Yeah, but I'll tell you this. Dr. King was killed and assassinated at the age of 39. Do you know which city was he in? Memphis, Tennessee. Do you know why he was there? Sanitation. He was fighting for the sanitation workers. And before he was killed, in my view, he delivered one of the most powerful, not inspirational or famous, but one of the most powerful speeches when he said, "We have difficult days ahead, and I might not be there with you, but I've made it to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land, and we as people will make it to the promised land." And I'll tell you this, through every generation there are struggles. And if people give up on hope, it's not just you sitting on the sideline. That's not the only cost or the only issue. To me, the issue is that you normalize some ideas that the next generations will take on, such as it's okay to have a state with one political party and one system. That's what democracy is. It's okay to live when corruption is there, when bad laws are there. So the cost to this is that you're passing on bad ideas to future generations. So it's my honor to stand up, even if I'm by myself. And I was, on multiple instances, I was the only no vote on the Senate floor on some of these bills. Some of them were not too bad. That's why some of my colleagues supported them, including nursing home issues. I was the only state senator last session to vote against a bill that even some of my colleagues supported. I went after the nursing industry because many senior citizens were dying, not just because of COVID, but because of negligence and abuse. And we have one of the most, and I promise you, I'm not conspiracy theorist. Go Google that stuff. Go Google that stuff. There are 5 executives from the American senior communities are spending time in federal jail here because of their embezzlement of finances in nursing homes in Indiana. So I introduced a bill to say, can we go after criminals, please? And the nursing industry poured millions of dollars in campaign finances for legislators. I'm proud that I took $0, and they did shut down that conversation. I'm introducing it again. But the point is, I will fight fiercely for my community, for every Hoosier, for what is right. The way that you can help is I welcome and I want to hear from you because I work for you. And if I don't meet your expectations, you get to fire me next elections. But what I would urge you to do is not only to reach out to your direct representative or senator, but reach out to the Republicans. Senator Jim Buck represents Westfield all the way to the borders of Kokomo. He is the chair of local government, and he's the one where I sent my bill to where it went to his committee. There are people that I fiercely oppose in the Senate on some policies that I'm working with them. So Senator Scott Baldwin, him and I clashed last session. He was the one who said, we shouldn't take moral positions on Nazism in the classroom. Remember House Bill 1134? He was the champion of that in the Senate. And we clashed, and we killed that bill even though I was in the minority. But the point is, he's trying to redeem himself in the Senate. And I extended that opportunity and said, would you be interested in working on this? And Patchwork, India, and others. So reach out to Republican legislators, not just Democrats. Be sure that you build coalitions across the state. Even this is not just Indianapolis issue. Talk about to South Bend, talk to Evansville, talk to other communities. And then finally, bring on board the business community. I've learned, I'll conclude with this, one of my Republican colleagues whispered in my ear, he said, Fatty, we're sick and tired of hearing about affordability because I can own $1 million mansion and claim that it's not affordable. So how about you use workforce housing? So I said, so that's all what it takes, me slapping the word workforce housing? Okay. So when you talk to some companies testified in the housing task force about the businesses can't find talent, and talent can't relocate to your communities if you don't have housing. So I'm trying to be very pragmatic about my language, about my approach, and I invest deeply in building relationships across the aisle to get things done. So don't give up. Please keep fighting the good fight. It's not just about you and me. It's about many generations to come after us. Lengthy answer, I apologize.
Senator, really fast, did you talk about number 16 from the Housing Task Force?
I think Andrew covered it, but basically,
I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that really fast.
15 recommendations were added or presented in that housing task force. I did everything I could in that committee to make the point that it's morally wrong for us to claim that we want to restore the American dream for every family in the state of Indiana and neglect close to 1 million people who are struggling. That's not, and I said last time I checked, the mission of that task force was not to help builders build more homes to those who can afford buying $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $1 million homes. That task force was created to deal with affordability. And affordability deals also connects with tenants and tenants' rights. So I was very happy to be able to add that. So we have two chairs, co-chairs of the committee. After I made the first appeal, the first co-chair said, we didn't talk about this. Made the second appeal, and some of my colleagues backed me up, and then the other co-chair was willing to include that 16th recommendation. And if you know anything about the General Assembly, if you're in the minority, it's very difficult to get anything done. But I'm happy to report to you that last session, I was able to pass 5 pieces of legislation. Some of them were embedded in other pieces. Some of them I removed myself as the author on my own bill, and I placed a Republican on my bill to get it done, because at the end of the day, it's not about credit, it's about getting the job done. And some of them were not satisfactory to me, meaning that they were changed into summer study committees. But last session, the bills that I passed were more than the entire Democratic caucus combined. And I take great pride of working for my community and building these relationships. I went there to work for you and not just to be called a state senator. That's my job. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Any final questions? We're good? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Senator. Kimberly Wolfo. Can we?
That legislation, and we'll be introducing it in the 2023 session, which begins in January.
Okay, is there language regarding protecting the tenant when they have to file, so there's no retaliation? And then is there also language where if that landlord has been, I guess, listed as an escrow model recipient because they're not taking care of their business, that there's some legal action to go towards that landlord if they show up multiple times regarding those issues? And then what is it to say if you have a tenant that's paying month to month and they were paying $600, now it's $1,400, and it's either at this or that, and there's still no recovery for things to get fixed, and then they're, forced to possibly have to leave and not have a place to live due to the condition.
So Indianapolis passed what they call the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and that was a few years ago. When I got elected in 2020, one of the first actions of the General Assembly was to overturn Indianapolis' city ordinance, which actually has these protections that you're talking about. So unfortunately, there's no willingness on the other side to deal with these issues, but doesn't mean that we can't work on it. So we attempted that route. I will continue to fight for these types of issues. We have a limit on the number of bills that we can introduce. So we as state senators for this upcoming session, we have a 15 bills limit, and the House has 5 per legislator. So my 15 bills, I dedicated 2 of them for housing-related issues. I have 2 of them for education, funding-related issues. I have a couple of them for health care, 1 for nursing homes. I have 2 of them that deal with property and state income tax to lower property taxes and income taxes. And then I have a child care bill to expand fully state-funded pre-K and child care, and a couple of others. So, and then I have a bill to help us build a tunnel on 86th Street. We had several accidents. So I'm, trying to connect the Monon Trail under a tunnel so that people don't have to. So that's one of the things that so there are a bunch of things that I'm within that limit. However, the ideas that you suggested, we can still work on them by introducing amendments. So even though we have limit on the bills, there are unlimited number of amendments that you can introduce on what they call germane bills, which means that basically the bill that you're introducing an amendment on, the topic and the code citation has to be relevant. So it is on my list of things to do. We'll see how the session plays out and how much there's political appetite to get things done. And I'm willing to take any win, because any progress on any of these topics is a win for our community. And every session, we'll just keep going back at it. I want to give a shout out to Andrew, to Hale, to AARP and others. I'm not sure if I'm missing anybody else. IUW, Indiana United Ways Association. I saw IUW, United Way of Central Indiana. I'm not sure, Becca, are you on behalf of the prosecutor's office today? Dick, are you on behalf of St. Luke's or anybody else besides yourself? Are you representing any organization today?
Yeah, we're representing our small housing justice task force.
Yes. So I missed probably many of you, and I appreciate you, but it's been a journey, a beautiful journey working with Prosperity, the Indiana Housing Coalition, the GIMA, is it GIMA or GIMA?
I would say GIMA.
GIMA, the Greater Indianapolis Multi-Faith Alliance, which has been focused on eviction issues, creating a database for bad landlords so we can track who they are, all of these types of things. It's an honor to have you in Senate District 30. If you didn't like your pizza, I had nothing to do with that. That's on Prosperity Indiana and the coalition. But sincerely, I really thank all of you. I appreciate your hard work. And if I ever can serve your families in any shape, way, or form, I'll be in the back. I'll give you my card. I work for you. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to be your public servant. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it. All right. Well, folks, we had asked for your time through 12:30. We're at that, but before I let you go, I do want to cover a couple of next steps, because everything Senator Kadora talked about in terms of the need to be able to contact your networks, to be able to expand this message, to reach people on the other side of the aisle, that's the work we have coming up next. So let me get to those next steps. You will get some of these things in a follow-up email, so I'm not going to go into this, but there's some steps you can take in terms of contacting your members of Congress. I do want to put that in your mind. There's federal actions that we could take right now. But in terms of upcoming steps, let me bring up Hale Crumley.
How do you do this?
You just hold it. It's a mic.
Oh, you don't push it down?
No.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So again, I'm Hale Crumley, Prosperity Indiana Coalition Coordinator, and I just wanted to cover some events coming up. There are more opportunities to engage like this, a little bit different from this, learning advocacy skills, and having actual meetings with your legislators in a smaller group than this. So, quick preview right here of what we've got going on, but I'm going to go through some of these in this series. So as you can see, there are some repeats on here. There's another Policy and Pizza just like this happening in Southern Indiana. If any of you have any reason to be there or have a colleague there, that is a series. We also have Advocacy Academy. That's a series as well. So I'm just going to go through those as series form. So the first one, Advocacy Academy. This is a really exciting series that I'm looking forward to. This is going to be helping you to get ready for State House Day, which is something that we organize so that you can come and set up individual meetings or small group meetings with your legislators to talk about these issues and say, hey, I want you to co-sponsor that bill because this is really important to me. So the very first, sorry about that formatting there. The very first session is called The Rules. So if you're a nonprofit organization and you need to know what rules there are regarding advocating, because there are rules, then that's a really good session for you. It'll be very thorough. We have Boulder Advocacy, a nonprofit who this is their whole job is to teach this, to make sure that you know the exact legality of how to do that. The second session is the strategies. So the strategies is what we do when we go in legislator meetings, and Andrew will be leading that with a bunch of Prosperity Indiana partners. The whole idea, though, is when you get that meeting on your calendar, what do you do when you go in there? What do you say? It's about giving the business case. It's about how to show data in a way that's useful, stuff like that. So that's going to be a really helpful session, too, to prepare you to have the conversation you want to have. And then that third one is the plan. So that's going to be a preview of Summit and State House Day, which is, again, things that we host. We help you get those meetings, so we'll give you all the technical details to get ready. And then we're also going to put everything into practice that we talked about before. So those strategies and those rules, we are going to have a simulated legislator meeting to show you what it's like. You may feel nervous going into these even though you've heard the strategies. Well, we're going to set up a fake one, and you can see exactly what it's like to engage with a legislator using those strategies, making sure you're in those rules. It's going to be really, really helpful. So all three of these are kind of a stepping ladder of advocacy. I encourage you to come to as many as possible. All of them are free. So, like I said, though, these are kind of in advance of our Summit and our State House Day. These are back-to-back events. The Prosperity Indiana Summit, you have the dates right here, and again, all this will be emailed to you. Please don't, feel like you need to memorize all this. But this is a whole day of learning on community economic development issues. We'll have a lot of people there. It's going to be a really amazing day. And excitingly, the very next day is our State House Day. So you're already in town for it. I know you guys already would be, but it's helpful for the people out of state, or sorry, out of county, not out of state. So this is also free. This is our State House Day, where we're going to help you set up those meetings that we were prepping for in that Advocacy Academy. We will help you get the meetings. We will even go in with you if you want to help you talk to your legislator about the issues that you're saying today that you care about. So we're really excited about this. Here's some things that we're going to be doing in those. Like I said, legislator meetings, insider walking tours. Some of the people around here who are at the State House really, really regularly are going to help show you where all these committee meeting rooms are, things like that. We're also going to do a letter writing campaign. If you can't get in touch with your person, but you still want to get in contact with them in some way, what you can do is write a letter and send it straight to them. And then we'll also do any legislative committee meetings that are on that day, but of course we have to see what's scheduled for that day. And then one more thing, really exciting, we've just picked the date for this, is our Housing Advocacy Day, which, Lauren, do you want to say anything about that really quickly? I know it's new. We just got it on the books.
Yes, it is new. We just had it on the books, definitely. This will be a great opportunity not only for those of us who are the professionals in the room, but also for tenants and community members as well to join in on this fight and to, I guess, let's bolster our voices together. Yeah. And the last quick, next events meeting, while I am at it, December 15th at 6 p.m. via Zoom, the Indianapolis Tenants' Rights meeting the Indianapolis Tenants' Rights meeting will host our general body meeting.
That's great.
Link to all.
Yes, if you get me that link, Lauren, I will share it with everybody. All right, thank you. Okay, and then my last bit here is if you want to learn about the coalition, I know some of you said you are not coalition members yet, it's free to join. We provide information like this all the time, but not too much, because if you have to read it, I have to write it. So I really encourage this, though. In advance of a very busy legislative session, you're going to want those updates that we can provide you with. And we'll filter through things that are really complicated and make sure it's accessible. So please sign up if you haven't already. If you don't want to deal with the QR code, come get my business card. I will sign you up. Really quick, I wanted to let you know about our other coalitions, just really quick, because we do have other issues that we talk about, like the payday predatory lending that we got a lot of comments on earlier. We are very active at the State House on that issue, too. So we have Housing for Hoosiers. This is a housing resource website. There's a lot of great things on here, like Tenant Bill of Rights. This is a place where you can access that information. The Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition is, of course, the group that is here today, so I won't bother on that one.
Court Watching Toolkit is on there, too.
Yes, the Court Watching Toolkit. We have a very active group here, so thank you so much for that. We also have the Assets and Opportunity Network. If you are a service provider for low-income Hoosiers, you may be very interested in this. We talk about a variety of issues that affect low-income Hoosiers. And then, like I said, the Hoosiers for Responsible Lending is very active at the State House on predatory lending, so if you're interested in that as well, come get in contact with me. Okay, thank you so much. If you want to be a Prosperity Indiana member, come contact us.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Hale. Appreciate all that information. So That's the conclusion of our event today. I want to give special thanks to all the PI members, all the coalition members, our partners, AARP, and the library for hosting us here, the Ross Foundation. And one more time, let's give a big round of applause to State Senator Fadi Kadora. He's been a real champion on these issues, and if we had 100 more just like him, we'd be in good shape, and that's where we need your help. So thanks again, everybody. Look forward to seeing you in the future. And there's more pizza. Please get more pizza.